Today I want to talk to you about simple faith, fish sandwiches, and how following Jesus is easy and challenging all at the same time. Now, I got to do this in two parts because some big ideas, and so that means you're going to need to be here next Sunday as well in order to hear everything that I have to offer around this idea. So the Apostle John, he collaborated with the Holy Spirit to produce what we call the Gospel of John. And John said that he wrote what he did so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now, last Sunday I said that Jesus offers us resurrection life, and resurrection life brings a change to us now, like immediately in the present and in the future. That's part of what resurrection life is. Now, John included a lot of details in his gospel, in his story about Jesus, and those details, they weren't just put in there by John to meet a word count. Like, do you remember maybe in high school you had a writing assignment, and you had a certain number of words or pages you had to produce for that? You know, it had to be a 5-page essay or some number of words, right? Then if you were like me, you made the margins as wide as possible so that you could have as few words as possible and yet have as many pages as possible. So John, though, he wasn't trying to just stretch things out by adding detail for no reason or meet a page count requirement. John provided the details he did for a purpose. He was very intentional. And often that purpose was to get the reader to think about bigger ideas and to make connections with what he was saying and what we read in what we call the Old Testament. And so John gives details very purposefully, very intentionally. And so as we're reading in John's gospel, we see him giving a lot of details about geography. And so I kind of want to start with just a little quick geography so that we don't move past these details too quickly on a casual reading. So I'm going to show you a couple of graphics and explain some things. Jerusalem, you'll see, is pictured at the very bottom. I get to use my laser pointer today. There it is. I don't know if that helped at all. But Jerusalem's right there in the bottom center of the map. The Sea of Galilee was also known, and you'll see in Scripture sometimes, as Lake Tiberias. So that lake all the way at the top is known as Lake Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee. That's again towards the top in the middle. All right, here's a little close-up of that so you can see a little better. Near the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, you'll see some town names. Maybe you recognize some of these and have heard them before from reading John's Gospel. You'll see Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. You'll see Cana, where Jesus performed his first miracle when he turned water into wine at a wedding celebration. Let's go back to the big map. In John chapter 4, Jesus is in the town of Cana. Then when you read John chapter 5, Jesus makes his way up to Jerusalem. Now, it's down on the map, so that might seem confusing, but I say up to because in the biblical author's mind, like in John's mind, Jerusalem was at a higher elevation. And so Jews would have thought of going up to Jerusalem, regardless of whether or not they were north, south, east, or west of Jerusalem. They went up to Jerusalem. John chapter 6 opens with Jesus having crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's what John 6 tells us. After performing an incredible miracle, Jesus left that area for Capernaum, kind of on the other side. Guess how Jesus got to Capernaum? He walked. I'm like, that doesn't seem all that special, does it? He walked on water. Now, the Sea of Galilee is 13 miles across, south to north, so the long way is about 13 miles. The east to west, the width is about 7 miles. That's a pretty good walk when you're coming from the other side to Capernaum, when you're walking on the water. John chapter 4 tells us this. Once more, Jesus visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. The royal official said, "Sir, come down before my child dies." "Go," Jesus replied, "your son will live." The man took Jesus at his word and departed. So Jesus told the man, okay, look, your son is going to live. And the official took him at his word and went home. He departed. So in this case, we see that taking Jesus at his word, it was easy for this guy. The official had no questions. He offered no objections. But Jesus, he just took him at his word and went home. And so that man showed simple faith by taking Jesus at his word. The official did his part, which was simple faith, taking Jesus at his word. And then Jesus did his part by healing his son. We read this: the man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, "Yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him." Then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." So he and his whole household believed. This was the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. Simple faith demonstrated by taking Jesus at his word is the starting point for the resurrection life that Jesus offers to everyone. Will you take Jesus at his word? I hope so. That's a question you have to ask and answer for yourself. Will you take Jesus at his word? And so whether it's for healing or the promise of new life, it begins with taking Jesus at his word. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Lake of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy food for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did this with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten them. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Now, one note about this event, this feeding of the 5,000. That's a lot of people, right? It's a lot of people. But kind of the way John did things and biblical authors did, they only typically recorded the men who were present. We can safely assume that there were women and children present that day. So that means Jesus fed a lot of people, right? Maybe 10 or 15 or 20,000 people. We don't know exactly. We do know, John says, at least 5,000. And even if it's only 5,000, again, that's a lot of people, right? I don't want to feed that many people. Now, The feeding of 5,000, this particular miracle by Jesus, is recorded in all four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all provide us an account of this particular miracle. But John offers us some interesting details that the other Gospel writers don't provide us. For example, John notes that the bread was made of barley. Now, a barley loaf was the inexpensive bread. It was like the kind of the white bread of first century Judea, right? This was the cheap stuff that poor people ate. And so that means the boy that was offering these barley loaves, he came from a lower socioeconomic class. He was poor. And probably many of the people that day that were fed by Jesus were also poor. John offers another unique description of these loaves and fish, at least in comparison to the other three accounts. See, John says that 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish were what was offered. See, it's just this addition of one word, the word small. What was offered to Jesus was small. But the size of what was offered was not a problem for Jesus. See, Jesus is the one who produces miracles with whatever is offered. The size of what's offered doesn't matter for Jesus. So, be that some small loaves or fish, or simple faith that we offer of taking Jesus at his word, Jesus can work with small. Again, it's not about the size of what we bring to Jesus, because any miracle is always going to be about Jesus and his power. Now, that's a truth that I didn't understand until very recently. In fact, I would say I didn't grasp this truth until about 5 years ago when I was working as a hospital chaplain. So very early in my training as a chaplain, I really didn't know what I was doing, but they sent me and my other trainees into patient rooms right from the start. So it's kind of like, hey, you're going to learn on the job. I'm like, okay, here we go. But that meant when I walked into a patient's room, I felt like I had very little to offer because I did not know what I was doing. And sometimes when I would go into those patient rooms, those people were really sick. Maybe they were dying and they had just been given that diagnosis. Maybe they had just died and I was with the family when their loved one had died. And in those situations, I'd enter that room and just feel like, I don't know what I have for you. I have so little to bring, to offer you. Now, because what I was doing was difficult, that was hard, I tried to make it a priority to start each morning with a time of prayer and Bible reading. And so it was in my first month or two serving as a chaplain, I just happened to read John chapter 6. I feel like that morning God gave me a real profound truth and insight when I read that Jesus was offered 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. And Jesus gave the miracle. See, when I understood that, that changed the way I walked into a patient's room. Before I was walking in, it was about me and what I thought I had to offer. But what God helped me realize is it was not about me. In fact, it was never about me because it was always about Jesus. See, that's true for you as well. It's always been all about Jesus. See, in our lives, it's not about us and whatever small we have to offer. It's about Jesus. So it doesn't matter if what we offer is small. Jesus has the power for miracles regardless of what we offer. Will you take Jesus at his word? Will you trust that he is able to provide the miracle? I find that life can be really hard sometimes. Maybe that's an understatement, right? Life beats us up, it breaks us down, and maybe you're in that place right now just feeling like, Jesus, even offering this small bit of faith feels hard. It feels really challenging to offer even small faith today. But here's the thing, Jesus can work with small. Jesus will meet you where you are, and then he will do his part. And so the size of our faith does not determine Jesus' ability to provide the miracle. It's not contingent upon us. It's, again, all about Jesus and his power and who he is. In fact, Jesus said that faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. So the crowd that experienced Jesus' miraculous feeding, they have something really important to teach us about Jesus and really about ourselves. And it's this: Jesus is not a supernatural vending machine, obligated to our desire or demand for a miracle. Let me say that again, because it's so critical you understand this about ourselves and about Jesus. Jesus is not a supernatural vending machine obligated to our desire or demand for a miracle. So with that in mind, let's see what the crowd has to teach us as we pick up the story after they had finished eating. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake. And when they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. They saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there. They, the crowd, got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the miracle I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." Did you catch that last little bit? It's a pretty harsh rebuke from Jesus to this crowd. You see, basically, Jesus is saying, like, "Hey, guys, listen. The only reason you are looking for me is you think you're going to get another free fish sandwich today. Come on, man." You see, the crowd was chasing Jesus for the wrong reasons. They were looking just to fill their bellies. And so here's what Jesus told the crowd. He said, "Do not work for food that spoils, but food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you." When I lived in New Orleans, and that's where I did my chaplain work. When I was living in New Orleans, for a time there was this billboard displayed in the city, and it said, "We don't eat to live, we live to eat." Let me say that again to be sure you caught that. We don't eat to live, we live to eat. And this billboard kind of flew over the city for a while. Now, at first, I couldn't decide how I felt about this sentiment being expressed. I knew for sure it was true of New Orleans. Like the culture there, yes, they live to eat. And then I had to be honest and say, it feels kind of true of me sometimes. Have you ever been eating a meal, and while you're eating, you're discussing and planning what the next meal's going to be? I mean, like you're at lunch talking about dinner. What are we doing for dinner tonight? You're in the middle of lunch. How ridiculous is that? I trust that you're laughing because you're maybe like me and have done that before. So I've decided, in preparing this message, how I feel about that billboard. I've concluded that living to eat is not a good approach to life. And here's the reason why. It sits way too close to the behavior of the crowd that was chasing Jesus for a free fish sandwich. And Jesus spoke with great clarity about the things of the world, things like food, and the things that we chase after. And he did so in Luke chapter 12. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat. For life is more than food. And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink." Don't worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things. And your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. See, the pagan world, those are unbelievers. Pagans are just John's way of saying those who don't follow Jesus. He says those who don't follow Jesus, they're the kinds of people who set their hearts on things like food. But you follower of Jesus, Jesus says to you, seek his kingdom. So that means that we have got to set our hearts on Jesus and nothing else. Nothing but Jesus. Setting our hearts on anything else, the Bible tells us, is idolatry. So even something as simple and necessary as food, it can be an idol if it occupies the place in our heart that should be for Jesus. See, I find that we humans, we have this remarkable ability to set our hearts on everything but Jesus. We can set our hearts on really anything. And understand, it's not just the obvious kind of bad things that people set their hearts on, like setting your heart upon pornography or sex outside of marriage. Yes, those are bad. The Bible's clear about them. We could set our hearts on those kinds of evils and bad things, but it's often the things that are neutral or even good that can take a place on our heart that belongs to Jesus. Food is neutral. Food is neither good nor bad, right? It isn't evil and sinful in itself. It's actually something we need. Like, we need to eat regularly. God knows that. But if it occupies a place on our heart that belongs to Jesus, then it's an idol. And that way, food is a lot like money. Money is also neither good nor bad. It's how you use it. And even things then that are generally considered good can be an idol in our lives. Things like career, things like relationship. When those sit in the spot that belongs to Jesus, they're an idol. So when things like career or relationship, those are the things that dictate and rule our hearts. They drive and direct our actions. There's a good chance those are the things that are ruling our heart and not Jesus. And that means if something else is sitting there, whether it's a relationship or a career or food, if something's already ruling our hearts, then Jesus can't. There can only be one ruler of your heart. That's why God, I believe, says that he is a jealous God. He is not willing to share the space of our heart with anything other or less than himself. And so here's how Jesus would explain it with this worldly thing being money. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. I don't want to be guilty of the sin of idolatry. I'm going to assume that neither do you. And so that means we have got to do what Jesus has taught. And what Jesus has taught is this. He says, do not work for food that spoils, but food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. And then they asked him, what must we do to do the works God requires? Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he sent. That's it. See, the work God requires is small. The work God requires is simple. And the work God requires is easy. Jesus has done and will do the hard things. The hard part's on him. Jesus is the one who provides the miracle. That's the hard part, right? I can't produce a miracle in my own life. I can't produce one for you. I'm feeling pretty confident none of you can also produce a miracle. That's Jesus' job. The work God requires is small. So our part in the work is small. It's smaller. Even smaller. Make it so small that it's really not about you. Or it's like John the Baptist said, I've got to decrease so he can increase. Right? We need Jesus to be the focus, to be the one. And we go, yes, Jesus, you could do it. I believe in you. And then we believe in Jesus. We believe that Jesus is all we need. And we believe that when Jesus said that faith need only be the size of a mustard seed, which is very small, but then that faith can grow when it's blessed and nurtured with God's help. The work of God is simple. Our part in the work is simply to believe Jesus. And the work God requires is easy. Though it may not feel like it, hear this. The work of God is easy because our part in the work is to take Jesus at his word. That's it. Your part is to take Jesus at his word. So today, stop chasing fish sandwiches and the things of this world and start taking Jesus at his word. Worship team, if you would come forward, we want to provide an opportunity for prayer and to respond to Jesus in any way that he is leading you today. So if you're able, would you please